Hey guys, so let's get into it. Session management. What is it? Um, Session management is about remembering who you're talking to. Okay, so when the user interacts with a web page, you can think of it like a conversation. You know, they show up at Amazon.ca, they start searching for products, they start adding things to the shopping cart, and often you can do that. In most cases, I think in Amazon, you can do that without even logging in. How does Amazon know when a user clicks on add this to my cart? How does Amazon.ca know who they're talking to? And that might seem like a silly question, but there is no way built into the HTTP protocol to uniquely identify who you're talking to. There's nothing automatically built in. HTTP and HTTPS are sometimes called stateless protocols. So you don't know if you're a web app receiving 100 hits a second, all these different requests, you have no way of linking one request to another to know whether those requests, any pair of those requests, are part of the same conversation. So we have to do some extra work, usually involving cookies, to figure out who it is that we're talking to. Okay, and that's really important because otherwise, I mean, you don't know what data to serve up. And if there's no way of really telling who you're talking to, then you may end up serving the wrong data to somebody, the wrong page. We all go to the same pages and we end up with different information. So that whole process of figuring out who you're talking to is called session management. Let me just illustrate the problem here with just a set of slides. This is the slide version of some pictures that are in the Module 5A guide. So this here is a picture of a two-page app. So here we have an HTML file that displays a form. Let's say it's a quiz, because that's an example I use later on. So this form has a little quiz. It's got 5 questions in it. The user fills it in and presses submit. It sends an HTTP request, which contains parameters for the form here, over to the PHP file. It retrieves and validates the parameters, processes the parameters, maybe stores the results, and then displays the view, some HTML page that's going to display the results. You know, congratulations, you got 4 out of 5 on the quiz, that kind of thing. Okay, so we know how to write this. This is pretty straightforward: input, processing, and output. The input happens on the HTML file, gets sent to the PHP file, which retrieves that input and does the processing and does the output. What I've put in the middle here is supposed to be a flow chart. So the circles are for start and end, the squares are for processing, and the parallelogram is for input and output. Okay, so that's how a two-page app works. But to see the problem that session management solves, just imagine a 3-page app. Imagine a 3-page quiz, right? So maybe some quiz questions are in part 1. When they submit, they go to part 2 of the quiz, and when they submit that, they go to the results page. So this is the final page. So if you think about it, we're going to fill in this form. We'll send the parameters here. We can retrieve and validate the parameters. And here's where we put out section 2 of the form, or section 2 of the quiz. But we need to be able to remember what the user entered over in section 1. We need to be able to remember it all the way over here. Anything that we store in variables in a PHP file will be gone when that PHP file stops executing. So PHP has no memory between sessions. Between executions of the PHP program. We can create a $Q1 variable that stores question 1 here, but it will no longer exist when we go over here. So we have to do some special kind of work here to somehow track this user, so that we know that when this request comes in, it's the same user that sent this request, and then somehow we're going to retrieve all the information that we stored here in this page. So the user fills in their form, sends off the data to page 1, PHP page 1, which somehow creates some kind of tracking system for that user, stores their data for that user, and then the next time we send a request, it can recognize that this is the same user and access that data. Okay, so this is done with cookies. Now, luckily, we don't have to deal with cookies ourselves, but it is important to know how it works. Let me show you a couple of things here. So over here in Canvas, if I hit F12 to go into the developer view here. Normally this takes us to Elements or Console. But if I go over to Application, I can look in the cookies here. And if I click on this thing here, so a cookie is a little piece of information that is, when the user sends a request, the response comes back and it contains, HTML to show the page, but it can also contain little bits of information called cookies. So cookies are little, I think there's a 4 kilobyte limit information, and that cookie information, if you've set your browser to accept cookies, which most people do, it then can store that in its own little database. So it has that cookie stored. And if you come in here, you can see all the cookies for Canvas. And see this one here, Canvas session. This is the value of that cookie is this weird looking, there you go, really long string that's a unique key that identifies me. So that the next time I click on something in here, what it does is, if it's the next request that goes back to mycanvas.mohawkcollege.ca, so when I click, for example, here, it sends, oh, that's not a good example because that is a, let's click here. Okay? I gotta leave the student view. Let's do that again. So here we are. So now we're here. There we go. There's my Canvas session cookie still there with hopefully still the same value, but let me just check. Let's go to a different course. Let's go to my machine learning course. There you go. You can see my Canvas session is still there and it hasn't changed. So what the browser does is it takes, if a request comes back with a cookie in it, it stores that cookie. It has a name and it has a value. So you see there's a bunch of cookies here. This one has a much more straightforward value. It has other information, so the domain that it's linked to. So this is a cookie for mycanvas.mohawkcollege.ca. It's got an expiry date usually. Expiry date of session means when I close this browser, this cookie will go away. These other ones have expiry dates, actual dates set, and so on. And the rest of it we don't have to worry about too much. Now, whenever I launch a new request to mycanvas.mohawk.ca, the browser looks in its cookie database to see what cookies do I have for that domain, and it finds this cookie here, for example, the session cookie, and when it sends the request, it attaches the cookie to it and sends it off to the server. So the server can retrieve that cookie, which is my session ID, which is unique, and say, aha, it's Sam again. Well, it doesn't know my name, but it knows this is, it can link me to all my previous requests, and it can store information based on that as well. Okay, if you go over to the Mohawk College site, you'll see the same. Any site you go to and go and take a look at the cookies, you'll find them. A lot of them will end with ID. These are various kinds of session ID cookies. There's one in here. Where is it? Oh, I thought there was a J session ID here. I guess not. Sometimes you can tell by the names of the cookies what actual language is being used. So if you see a J session ID, then it's a JavaScript session ID. Sorry, a Java session ID. So they're using the Java programming language on the back end, probably using servlets. And if you see PHP session ID, then you know that they're using PHP on the back end as well. Now you don't. I mean, often they will change that and implement their own system, but that's the idea. So, before we get into the details, this is how session management works. So here are the steps. The client sends a request for a PHP script. So the client sends a request to the server. And then if you decide to, as the PHP programmer who wrote that script, you can ask the server to start a session. So the server itself is managed by the session. So here it is. I included a command that asked the user to start a session for this request. And it gave it an ID. Just to be simple, we'll call this session 323. And then when I'm finished my response, I can then store data. By the way, I have a special object I can store data in, and I'll show you how this works in a second. But when I'm done all of my processing in PHP here, then the server sends back to the client the response. So all the response that I've created, the echo statements and everything. But when it does that, it attaches a cookie called PHP session ID, PHP sesh ID, which has the ID of the session. So this continues to exist in the server's memory. I send that back to the client. The cookie's stored somewhere inside the client, so inside Chrome or Firefox. Then sometime later on, the client sends another request to my same server, this will automatically, the browser will automatically include that PHP session ID cookie, which comes to here. So I get the cookie, and over here in my script, I ask the server to start a session, and it says, okay, I'll check for cookies. It finds a cookie with a session ID 323, and it says, hey, guess what? I already have a session for that, so I'll just link you to that session. And now any data that I stored in this session object, I can access. So this is how we're going to do it with a 3-page app. We're going to, first page receives it, starts a session, stores information in the session, and then when the request for the third page comes in, it's able to, because of the cookie, it's able to link to that session and get the information out of it. Okay, let's look at some examples of this working. So what I've done here in the code that you guys have, there's a folder called, this is in the Module 5 code, a folder called W3 Schools. These are some examples because I thought they were nice small examples that I copied and adapted from W3 Schools a few years ago. I think they still use them. But let's have a look because this shows us everything in action. So the first one here is called Set Session Values. Okay, now there's a few things going on here. First thing that we do, notice at the very top, there's a PHP script which has some comments in it, but the main thing it has in it is session start. This is what tells the server we want to track this user. We want to start a session. So this causes the cookie to be created. And then, you know, the rest of it we've seen before. Down here in the body, I am setting 2 session values. So there's this special object. It's called a super global because it's accessible everywhere, called $_session, and it's an associative array. So I can store, using string keys, I can store anything I want here. It can be numbers, it can be strings, it can be objects, I could store an entire array of stuff here if I wanted to. So it's really unrestricted, and this lives, as long as the server doesn't reboot, this lives in the server's memory. Okay, so I've set 2 things, favorite color and favorite animal, and then I just echo session variables are set. So that's all that this file does. Let's watch it. Here we go. So let's take a look. First of all, let's open this up. Notice, so I'm on localhost here because I've got XAMPP running. I currently have no cookies. Okay, I'm going to go into W3 Schools. Still no cookies. I'm going to go to Set Session Values. This is going to send off a request for set session values, which runs this script, and because I called session start, it's going to return a PHP session ID cookie. So there it is. There's my session ID with this value in it. Okay, so the server has taken care of this for me. It's generated the cookie, sent it back. It's generated a unique ID that it won't assign to anybody else, and sent it back to me. So now my session variables are set. The variables themselves, the stuff that I stored, right here in $_session, belongs to the server. So it lives on the server. So let's go down here and take a look at access session values. Okay, so now I want to be able to recognize the user and read their favorite color and their favorite animal. So I'm doing that here. Favorite color is $_session_fav color. Favorite animal is $_session_fav animal. This will only work if the user has previously gone to set session values. Notice I still have to call session start. So what's going to happen is when I send a request for this, notice PHP session ID is still here. When I go to access session values and I send that request by clicking here, it's going to attach this cookie to the request, which means that when I do session start in my code, it will be able to look up, the server will recognize it and will be able to look it up. So when I go access session values, it works like a charm. So it's printed out green and cat. Okay, there's a few other examples here as well. Modify session values. So again, starts with a session start, but here I'm just changing the favorite color to yellow. Again, when I go modify session values, it's going to tell me that it's been set to yellow, and if I go back and access the session values, now it says my favorite color is yellow. If I go back to set session values, it'll reset it to green. Access, it's green now. So I can essentially, well, for all intents and purposes, permanently, I have long-term storage now. I have long-term storage inside this $session object that's going to, and all the work of recognizing the user is done for me. So as long as I call session start, I can then look in $session to see what I've stored there. What did I previously store in here for this user? And I can use this to figure out who the user is, what they've been doing, where they've been on my site. I can do all kinds of tracking and figure out who they are and give them a custom experience. Okay, I also have a couple of other things here. You can do a var dump on the session array. I'm also doing a var dump on this other thing called $_cookie. I mean, if you want to, in PHP, you can access and modify cookies yourself. You can set your own cookies. But we're not going to do that in this course. We're just going to let the server do it for us. But if you want to see what's in the cookie array, which would be any cookies that were sent, you can do that. So let's go back here, dump session and cookie. So there you go. Here's my session array. It's an associative array with two things in it, favorite color and favorite animal. And here's my $cookie array, which this is what was sent, was a PHP session ID with this value in it here, which is here. So it's a cooperation between the server and the client. But from the point of view of the PHP programmer, there isn't much you have to do. You just have to remember to call session start. And when you've done that, then you have access to this $session object, which you can assume, because in the background the server works it out for you, you can assume that you've been linked to the correct session, that any variables that are stored in here, any values that are stored in $session, belong to the same user that sent that original query. Okay, so that's basically how it works. What else can we see here? Notice it's set to expire on session. There are actually two kinds of expiry that can happen. So if I, let me close the browser. Let me just copy this. Let me close the browser here and reload it, reopen it, and then I'm going to go back here. And you'll notice there's nothing in the session and there's nothing in the cookies because I didn't send a cookie this time. I have a new session ID cookie now. So basically when I came in, when I left, it erased that cookie which only existed for the session. And when I came back, I called session start, which then created a new session for me. So there were no cookies sent for this request, and there's nothing, and there's a new session created, and there's nothing in the session. If I reload now, it'll send that new session ID cookie like that, but there's nothing in the session. Okay, and that's a bit dangerous. If a session expires, let me go back here, and I go to access session values, I'm going to get errors. See that? Undefined index on line 21 and line 22, because I'm trying to access, where are we? Access session values. I'm trying to print out these values, but they haven't been set yet. If I want to set them, I have to, for this example, I have to go back to set session values and then go back and access them, and now I can access them. So that's something you have to watch out for. Okay. Let's just quickly go down here and take a look at the commands that I introduced here. So session start, anytime you're using sessions, that has to go at the top of your file. And it must be, there's a rule here, it must be the very first thing you do before there's any output. So that means before even the doctype tag. If you don't do that right, if you put this lower down, it might still work 9 times out of 10. It's going to depend on the server, because the server, as it's reading your file, it caches it, sorry, it buffers it, and then eventually it will write it into the HTTP response. But once it starts writing the body of the HTTP response, it can no longer put cookies in there. Cookies have to come first and then the body. So if you don't do session start first here, your program might crash. So it has to be the very top, the very first thing you do before you echo or before you have any HTML code. And it's also, you'll notice in my examples here, I put doctype right here. I don't even put a carriage return here. If I go Alt-Shift-F, you got to watch out because Alt-Shift-F will move it down like that. If doctype is not the first thing in your document, the browser might go into quirks mode. So we do this to make sure there isn't even a blank line before this. Quirks mode just means that it may not operate according to standard HTML5. It might render things a little different, so that can kind of hurt cross-browser compatibility. So best practice is to have your session start and then your doctype like that. I would put it all on one line like that, and then have the rest of your PHP code after that. Okay, so session start is the first thing, and it has to come at the very top. Then once you've done that, you have access to this associative array called $_session. You can access it in any functions and methods. It's a super global, meaning it doesn't have to be declared. It's just always there. And you can access it through using the square brackets. You can assign things to it, read things from it, and so on. This is important, though, is that because a session can expire in the background. So if the user, there's two ways a session can expire. One is the user closes their browser, and then they lose their PHP session ID cookie. The other way is that if the session data gets too old on the server will dump it. And you can change that, but it's tricky on PHP to change that. But by default, session data hangs around for about a half an hour. So if the user goes away to get a cup of coffee and comes back, their session data may not be there anymore. But they may still have the page up, so they'll click to the next page, and you try to access their $session values, and they're not there anymore. So this function becomes really important. It's isSet. So what you're asking here is, does the session variable have something in it called key? Yes or no? And then you can check. You can check the session values you expect to be there to make sure that they're there, and if they're not there, you can give the user a session expired message. In fact, you know what? Let's do that over in Access. Let's do that right here. So what we can do right here is we can say if not is set $session fav color, or not is set $session fav animal. Okay, so we're asking, have I got an extra bracket here? There we go. So if either of these is true, so notice the not here. So isSet's going to return true or false. So this will return false to true. So if that's not set, or that's not set, why doesn't it like this? Unexpected or. Oh, I see what's going on. I forgot this bracket here. There we go. Then what we can do is say echo session expired. Please start again. And we could even put a link here to the next page. Otherwise, we know that we're okay, and we can go on and tell the user what they've got. Okay, so there you go. That's how you would use isSet. I'll post that later on. So right now it'll work just fine. But if I copy this address, so notice my my PHP session ID starts with 77, like that, 77 MTC. Close this. Reopen, paste, session expired, please start again. And see, I have a new session here. So, session was expired. Now if I go back here, set session values, now I can go back and access them and it's okay. Okay, but also, I mean, if you want to try this, if you just wait for about a half an hour, maybe give it 40 minutes just to be sure, and hit reload, you'll get the session expired message. Because it'll have flushed out on the server, it'll have flushed out everything that you stored there. And again, that can be changed. You can change that to like 60 minutes or a day or 6 months or whatever you want. You can have session data hang around for as long as you want. Okay, I think there is one other, which is destroy session here. So session unset and session destroy, they're basically the same thing. There is a minor difference between them. Unset just clears out the $_session. Session destroy removes the session entirely. But they're essentially doing the same thing. When you decide when a user logs out or when they're finished and you don't want to remember the user anymore, you use session unset. I would use them both, session unset and session destroy. Notice you have to start the session first, though. You still have to hook up the script to the original session before you can destroy it. And if we go over to destroy session here, so notice I still have a session ID here, but now it says session destroyed. Go back here, access session values, session has expired, it says, because it no longer has access to that stuff. So we have to modify. We can set and then modify and then gain access, and they're there. Okay, so that is the basic piece of sort of hardware that we use to track users. Okay, now there's a couple of exercises I'd like you to try, or an exercise I would like you to try. Let's go in here and I'll show it to you. Just got to wait for my thing to boot up here. Alrighty, so under sessions, here's the exercises. Here we are. So I want you to write the 3-page quiz app. Okay, so the first 2 pages should each contain 3 quiz questions requiring 1-word text answers. I don't care what the questions are. They can be whatever. It doesn't matter. Store the answers they enter in a session and display their score on the final page, and destroy the session on that page as well. So that's a 3-page quiz app. There's also this 3-page guessing game. Ask the user to enter a range on the first page. On the second page, you make a random number, store it in the session, and ask them to guess, and give them a form for that. And then on the third page, tell them whether they got the number right, and destroy the session. Okay, so those are the 2 possible exercises. I would start with the 3-page quiz app. So to go back to what it looks like here, whoops, here we are. So they send a request here. Your PHP file here its main job is to show the second section of the form, but you can start a session and store the answers that they gave you for the first 3 questions. Then you display the next 3 questions, which get sent this way. You retrieve questions 4, 5, and 6 answers come from here. Questions 1, 2, and 3 answers come from the session, because they were created back here and stored in the session here. And then you can mark the quiz and give the result. Okay, so that's the idea. So I want you to give that a try, and we will take this up in class. The next video has basically that's all you really need to know. The next video just walks through some examples, including a login example that I think you'll be interested in, and then the next video after that talks about using AJAX, because we have to do session management when we're sending AJAX queries as well. We have to check that the session exists too. So those are the 2 extra things, but other than that, this is the basics. All right, I'll see you in the next video.